What if the woman everyone thought was weak carried a secret deadlier than bullets? In 1872, Arizona, a silent widow reveals her Apache training when ruthless men try to break her. Like, subscribe and tell us, where are you watching from? Your support keeps these frontier stories alive. Let's get started. The year was 1872, deep in the Arizona territory, where dust rose like smoke and the law came slower than bullets. Ada Whitlock, a widow of 32, lived on a ranch left to her by her late husband, Samuel. Folks in town thought her meek, a woman who barely spoke and kept her eyes low, always wrapped in a grey shawl. They whispered pity over her loneliness, but Ada carried no sadness on her face. What they did not know was that Ada's silence was not weakness. It was forged in survival, and silence, she believed, could cut sharper than any blade. As a girl of 10, Ada's world had been torn apart when her family's wagon was attacked on the open trail. The wagon was burned, her kin taken by death, and she would have followed had the Apache not found her wandering in the smoke. They did not pity her. They demanded strength. Ada learned to skin hides, gather roots, and wield knives with a precision born from necessity. Her tongue stayed quiet, her ears open. She watched, mimicked, endured. Blades were her teachers, and silence became her shield. By womanhood, she had mastered both arts, even as fate carried her elsewhere. When Samuel Whitlock, a rancher of fair means, married her, Ada accepted his quiet offer of steadiness. She put down roots on the land, and though she never bore children, she kept the house standing, the stock watered, and the soil worked beside him. But Samuel had been killed by fever, leaving her alone on the ranch's weathered boards. Many thought she would abandon it, but Ada remained, tending the cattle and patching fences as if each nail was a promise. To the townsfolk, she seemed a fragile widow clinging to land she could not manage. They were blind to her truth. That truth was tested one evening when ruffians rode out of the canyon. Jed Barker and his crew of drifters, men known for raising dust and trouble wherever whiskey led them. Their laughter reached her porch before their boots did, cruel and sharp, cutting into the silence of the twilight. 5 of them dismounted, their horses stamping at the earth, while another circled wide, eyeing her corral. They looked upon the cabin like scavengers around carrion. Jed Barker, broad and scarred from old knife fights, grinned like a wolf that had cornered a lamb. "Pretty little place," he sneered, tapping his pistol on her doorframe. Ada stood in the doorway, shawl drawn close around her shoulders, eyes lowered, her face unreadable. The men mistook her stillness for fear and chuckled, trading coarse remarks. One spat tobacco into the dirt and muttered about widows being easy pickings. "Ain't no man here to guard it?" Barker asked loudly, stepping closer. The others followed, pushing through the threshold as if it belonged to them. Inside, they tipped her table, spilled her grain, poured at the few belongings she kept from Samuel. One kicked over the iron kettle by the hearth. Their mockery rang loud, but Ada's silence was unbroken. Jed leaned closer, his breath stinking of rot-gut whiskey, his grin cruel. "A woman like you don't belong out here alone," he whispered, his tone oily. His hand brushed her shoulder, testing her stillness, seeing if she would flinch. But Ada's gaze never lifted, and her expression never betrayed her thoughts. Instead, her fingers moved slowly beneath the folds of her apron. She felt the familiar weight of steel hidden there, blades she had sharpened not for chores, but for defense. The ruffians thought her meek, thought her silence weakness, but Ada's heart beat steady, waiting for the right moment. One of the men, Tom Greaves, a lanky brute with a scar down his cheek, laughed as he upended her cabinet, scattering jars of dried beans and corn across the floor. "Look at this," he mocked. "She thinks she's a farmer." Another ruffian found Samuel's old coat hanging by the wall and tugged it down, spitting on the dust-worn fabric. The cabin echoed with destruction, every crash testing Ada's composure. Yet she stood in the center, unmoving, watching through lowered lashes, noting where each man placed his weapon. She counted them not with fear, but with the cold clarity of someone trained to survive. Outside, the horses snorted restlessly, as though sensing violence in the air. The dusk deepened, painting the land in red shadows. One man pulled open her chest, finding the folded quilt Ada had sewn years ago. He tossed it aside, laughing. She keeps the place too neat for someone alone. The words struck Ada not as insult, but as warning. These men weren't merely here to steal food or drink. They wanted to break her. Jed Barker, still close, tilted his head as he studied her face. "What's the matter, widow? Cat got your tongue, or are you too scared to speak?" Ada finally raised her eyes, meeting Barker's gaze with a look as flat as stone. Her silence unnerved him, though he covered it with a sneer. "Maybe we ought to teach her to talk," one of the drifters joked, earning a round of coarse laughter. They crowded closer, their shadows stretching long across her floorboards. Ada's fingers tightened around the knife's handle beneath her apron. She could hear her old Apache teacher's voice in memory. "Wait until they lean close. Wait until they think you're weak. Strike once, strike true, and let fear do the rest." Her heartbeat slowed into readiness. The lantern hanging above the table swung gently as one man knocked it with his elbow. The flame flickered, shadows dancing wildly over the cabin walls. The air felt thick, heavy with the promise of violence. Jed Barker reached again, his hand moving as though to grasp her chin, to force her to look up. But before his skin touched hers, Ada shifted. Her hand slipped from the apron, the steel flashing under the lantern light. The blade kissed the air between them, too quick for his eyes. He froze, shock spreading across his face as her silence finally revealed its edge. The men stilled, laughter choking into silence, their bravado cut short. Jed's grin faltered as he realized the widow he thought defenseless held more danger than he imagined. Ada did not speak, did not threaten. She simply stood, the knife steady in her hand, her gaze cold as the desert moon. The weight of her stillness pressed on them heavier than gunfire. For the first time that night, Barker hesitated, reading. Something in her eyes he had never expected. Discipline, training, and the kind of silence that only came from surviving fire and steel. The cabin had shifted. The night had changed. Night pressed close around the ranch, the desert still save for the rowdy voices inside. The men thought her frail, a shadow in her shawl, but Ada's mind was sharp as steel. She counted each outlaw. By his movement, the way his boots scraped the floorboards, the rhythm of his drawling laugh, their cruelty made them careless. Her father's Bible sat untouched on the mantel, while her knives, Apache forged and worn smooth from years of practice, rested near her hands. Silence was no longer a shield. Tonight, silence would become her weapon, one sharp strike at a time. The first blow came swift. One outlaw lunged with a drunken grin, grabbing her arm as though she were nothing but prey. His grin died with the glint of steel. Her blade cut his sleeve wide open, slicing the flesh beneath, shallow but stinging. His howl shook the rafters. The others spun, startled, fumbling for pistols that caught the lamplight too late. Ada's second knife flew from her hand, sinking into the wooden post beside another man's head. His eyes widened, fear where arrogance had stood. The air shifted, the game had changed. Furniture splintered as boots scraped against the floorboards. Rough curses filled the cabin, but Ada was already moving. Her steps were silent, the rhythm of a hunter. She slipped into shadow, her shawl blending with the dim corners of the room. Each knife stroke was precise, not meant to kill. Yet one man dropped his revolver, blood spilling down his knuckles. Another tripped on a chair she had kicked over, his curse breaking into a startled cry. They weren't fighting a widow anymore. They were fighting a phantom. Jed Barker, their leader, barked orders, though the cracks in his voice betrayed his unease. "She's just a woman. Grab her." His pistol waved wildly, But Ada had already slipped past him, the edge of her blade, whispering along his coat sleeve. His heart jolted in terror as he realized how close it had come. Ada did not answer his taunts. Her silence was heavier than threats, her movements sharper than his bluster. She was no meek widow. She was the lesson he never wanted to learn. Lanterns swung wildly, throwing long shadows against the cabin walls. The men lunged at ghosts, their bullets carving holes into Ada's furniture, into the walls her husband had once built with his hands. But Ada's knives always moved faster. Each strike drew a gasp, each wound shallow but deliberate, designed to weaken, to unnerve. Sweat rolled down their faces as they stumbled, suddenly aware that the woman they mocked knew the language of survival better than any of them. When one outlaw finally fell, clutching his arm where her knife had bitten, deep the others froze. Their laughter, their jeers, gone. Fear replaced it, an unfamiliar weight pressing their chests. Ada stood in the center of the room now, shawl fallen to the floor, knives glinting in both hands. Her breathing was steady, eyes unblinking. She looked nothing like the timid widow they had found. She looked like the stories whispered in saloons, the Apache-trained ghost with blades for hands. One man bolted first, tripping over the doorway in his panic, scrambling into the night without a backward glance. The others faltered, eyes flicking to Jed for courage he could not muster. She stepped closer, knives gleaming with a predator's patience. Another fled, then another, their bravado unraveling into terror. Soon, only two remained. Bloodied, groaning on the floor, too weak to crawl. Jed lingered, his pride chaining him to the room, his pistol shaking in his grasp. Ada's silence crushed him harder than any bullet could. Jed tried to sneer, but the sound cracked. "You think you're safe now? You think this ends?" His words were desperate, hollow. Ada raised one knife, its point catching the first pale light of dawn leaking through the shutters. She didn't lunge. She didn't need to. Jed saw his own cowardice reflected in her stillness, and it broke him. He backed toward the doorway, stumbling over his fallen men. By the time he crossed the threshold, his smirk had rotted into pure fear. The desert morning broke red across the horizon, painting the land in fire and ash. Ada stood in the doorway of her cabin, blades in hand, shawl at her feet. Behind her the cabin bore scars, bullet holes in the walls, blood spattered on the floorboards, broken chairs scattered like bones. But she still stood, unbroken, a widow, carved by silence and sharpened by Apache steel. The ruffians who had mocked her had fled into the dust, carrying with them a story they would never dare to retell truthfully. By noon, word had already begun to ripple through the nearby town. Whispers carried faster than wagons, faster than telegraphs. The tale of Ada Whitlock spread from lips of cowhands to barkeeps, from saloon girls to ranchers. They spoke of a silent widow who fought like a spirit, who stood alone against a pack of outlaws and drove them off with knives and shadows. Some said she was blessed by the Apache, others swore she was cursed, but all agreed on one thing: she was not to be trifled with. When Ada returned to her ranch chores that day, she did. So without ceremony, she fed the chickens, mended the corral, and drew water from the well. Yet everything had changed. Where once neighbors pitied her, they now regarded her with awe. No one would look at her and see only a quiet widow again. They would see the strength of someone who had survived fire, blade, and loss. They would see the woman who had turned silence into a weapon. And in the West, that kind of reputation was worth more than gold. Ada never sought thanks or fame. She asked for no recognition, no visitors, no applause. Her knives were cleaned and tucked away, her shawl mended and worn again. To passing strangers, she was still the same silent woman tending her lonely ranch. But beneath that shawl, in her silence, she carried a truth the world could never steal. She had faced the darkness and sent it running. And if it ever returned, she would be ready, not because of vengeance, but because the frontier demanded it. By sundown, the desert wind had swept away the tracks of Jed Barker and his crew, leaving no trace of their humiliation, but the memories etched in their minds. Somewhere in the wild expanse, they carried the tale of their defeat, their pride forever scarred. Ada watched the sun sink behind the canyons, her knives resting on the windowsill. She had been forged in loss, tempered by survival, and trained by hands that taught her silence and strength. And though she stood alone, she was never defenseless. In the West, silence was more powerful than any gun.